My name is Carlton. Again, I always start by telling I'm a naturalist. And of course, a naturalist is somebody who studies, enjoys nature quite a bit. And from the turnout today, it looks like a lot of you are naturalist minded as well. I do live up in the Mills River area, up the mountain a little bit, but I love coming to Polk County. I had some relatives that used to live in Polk County down Basin Mountain. Used to come here when I was a kid a lot, even though I was actually born and raised in Charlotte. Used to come up here to Polk County, visit them a lot, and also in the Henderson County area. And of recent, I've been doing a lot of, well, not the last couple of years, but before that, been doing a lot of fishing down at Lake Adger, and I just really like the Polk County area. It's kind of a neat mix of the Piedmont and the mountains kind of rolled into one here at the base of the Blue Ridge Escarpment. So I love getting able to come down and visit this area here. So thanks for inviting me to come today. And I hope you can see the things I'm going to show you here because the lights are kind of dim. I think we're making it nice for the owls. I don't know if you can see me though, but in any case, maybe get a little more light and yeah, well, okay, there you go. But this program is today about owls. I call it Owls Masters of the Night, and pretty informal. If you have a question during the program, by all means, I'll try to answer your question, but I'll probably be answering a lot of your questions later on. You know, but if you have a question immediately, right, then go ahead and ask if you like to. And then afterwards, I'll hang around for a little bit. There's some things you might look at here, pick up, that sort of thing. I'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. And we do have some live owls for you to visit with today. I brought two different species of owls here. I'm going to talk about all the different owls that actually make their home here in this area on a consistent year-round basis. And I'll mention a couple other species that might come in this area from time to time as visitors. My kind of connection with owls is obviously as a naturalist you work with a lot of different animals, and owls being one of those very mysterious animals that we get to work with. But also I get to work with them a little closer than a lot of people because I also do some wildlife rehabilitation work. And I concentrate mostly on birds of prey, which means hawks, owls, falcons, those types of birds like that. And some people throw in vultures with that as well. So I work with vultures as well. A few mammals, a lot of reptiles. Reptiles are one of my specialties as well. But I get to work with a lot of owls. And when you get to work with a lot of owls as a rehabilitator, you end up with some owls that can't be released for one reason or another. And those are the type of owls that we're visiting with today. We'll talk about why they cannot be released. But that's part of the story of owls in general. But generally speaking, you know, if I was to take a consensus vote here, sometimes I won't do it today, but sometimes I'll actually have people in the audience raise their hand and say, how many of you ever actually seen an owl in the wild? And depending on whether you're an outdoor related person or an indoor related person or somewhere in between, usually about a third to a half of the group will raise their hand and say, yes, I've actually seen one in the wild. And other folks are folks that would like to see one, would recognize one if they saw it. But generally speaking, owls are kind of those mystery animals that a lot of people hear from time to time because they're vocal, and they've seen a lot about them on TV, documentaries, and that sort of thing. But when it comes down to actually experiencing an owl in the wild, a lot of people have never seen one. And it makes them a very mysterious animal. So any animal that's very nocturnal like that is a little bit mysterious to us. But also an animal like an owl is especially mysterious because they have some very unusual life cycles and places they live. They're not the most common animal compared to some of the other creatures we see since they're a predatory animal and up near the top of the food chain. So owls generate interest with a lot of different people. So what I want to do today is introduce you to the different species of owls that are found in our area, intersperse that with a little bit of folklore maybe, because owls do figure in folklore a good bit with some people groups, let you see some live owls and talk a little bit about some of the life cycles of owls and maybe what you can do to go see one. So with that said, let's get started with a little journey into the world of owls. Now, of the owl species that I brought here, I have some live ones, but also have some just pictures, okay? So the first one is a picture of an owl that's probably the most common owl that we have around this area. And I would have brought one of these today, but owls are one of those animals that are highly regulated and protected by law. And for the owls to come that you see here today, they have to go through a permitting process through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And to make a long story short, I've got an owl that could have come visit today that was a screech owl, but I'm waiting on his permits to arrive in the mail. So legally I couldn't bring him today, okay? But we can talk about it, okay? And this is an owl, not the smallest owl that's found in this region, but is one of the smallest. Is probably the owl that most people are most familiar with, and it's called a screech owl. Okay, so raise your hand if you've heard of a screech owl. That's probably one of the more common types of owls around our area. Screech owls are about the size of my hand if I put my hand together like that and kind of scrunch it down. So a really big screech owl would cover up most of my hand there, but an average size screech owl, some of my hand might be shading even the top of it. They're a little short owl, about maybe 8 to 10 inches tall when they stretch out, and one of our smallest owls. They're found in our area. Now, it's very unusual that they have a name screech owl because that's really not the sound they make, you know. And I'm not saying a screech owl can't make a screeching sound. They can, but it's usually one we hear in captivity under stress. It's not a call they would normally make in the wild. And I'll be playing a few owl calls for us as well, because one of the neat things about owls are the sounds that they make. And of course, like any other bird, you can identify their call and tell what kind of a bird it is. And that's important with owls because a lot of times you never get to see the actual bird. But screech owls are probably one of the best known owls in our area. And because they're small, they can live very, very close to people. Whereas other owls have to have very large territories to find their food. Some owls that are smaller, that was not one of them, can exploit small habitats close to people. So depending on where you live, you may have a lot of these different owls all in the same area, but even if you live in a city area, you have just a few trees out back, a tiny little wood lot between houses in a neighborhood, chances are you have screech owls because they're very good at living in places, little what I might call pocket habitats where other people, other types of owls may not live. So sometimes we come in contact with them. Now, screech owls come in two distinct color varieties, and a lot of the books you'll see on owls, they'll call them phases. And to me, a phase really like, you have a child, you're raising your child, it goes through that certain phase and it goes to another phase, or we're on our certain phase, we go in another phase of life, which means we change. But when you're a color phase of an owl, you don't change. That's what color you are. But we have two basic color varieties, might be a better way of putting it. Screech owl, one's called the reddish phase, or reddish brown, and the other's called the gray phase. And depending on where you're at, one or the other could be most common, or from year to year it seems to change. In the same litter you might have one of each or two of each or whatever. So there doesn't seem to be any specific thing that guides that other than just genetics in the local area. Right now it seems like for the past few years, most of the owls I get to see as a wildlife rehabilitator, ones I observe in the wild, are mostly the reddish phase. But a number of years ago, it seems like they were mostly the grayish color variety. So it just kind of goes back and forth. But a lot of people see these screech owls because they're small and they mistake them for great horned owl juveniles, baby great horned owls. And great horned owls are one of those owls that are very recognizable because of feather tufts that stick up. And screech owls have that, but they're not baby great horned owls by any means. But we see them quite often. In fact, a lot of times owls hunt beside the highway for rodents and small insects and mice along roadside edges, particularly where a highway cuts through a wooded area. And screech owls often wind up getting hit by cars. So, and you're driving down the road, a lot of times you're paying a lot of attention, you'll see a lot of little screech owls hit by cars, particularly in the winter or very early spring is the time that they seem to be hit by them the most. And a lot of times they're killed, but sometimes you'll come upon one that is injured and might be able to be rehabilitated. So screech owls live very, very close to people. Now we're going to play the call of a screech owl, and just for fun, I want to, on the count of three, I want everybody to give me their best owl call imitation. What do you think? Maybe that's pretty close for some owls. What do you think? What do you think the general call of an owl would be? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Everybody seems to think that owls all hoot. I'm not saying that none do. Some do. But did you know that a lot of owls don't hoot? Believe it or not. And screech owl is one of those. So let's listen to a little bit of a call of what a screech owl actually does sound like. See, it's really more like a mournful wailing call, kind of, and then sometimes backed up with a little trilling sound. It sounds like some kind of an insect or frog or something like that. And sometimes that sound is not nearly as loud as you hear it on the tape there. You know, owls can amplify pretty well. Screech owls have this quiet little call that's quieter than it was on the tape there, and you'll hear it and you think it's something way off in the distance, but it's really close to you. And if the wind blows just a little bit, it muffles the sound, but it's very ventriloquistic. You think it's coming from much further away, but it's really very close. But it's a plaintive, kind of a quavering, whistling sound. And the Cherokee Indians in particular had a myth that they thought that this it's a myth, obviously, but they believe it for sure, that when you heard a screech owl call like that, that was a bad omen, that somebody you knew was going to die. So, if you were a Native American, you would not want to be hearing a screech owl call. But I've heard in other cultures that hearing something like an owl call is a good omen. So it depends on where you live and what you believe and all. But owl calls are very, very unique. Now, screech owls are what we call a cavity nester. And even though owls are highly protected by state and federal law, and you can't possess even a feather of one, or a dead bird, or definitely a live bird without a special permit, you can actually, there is a way for you to have your very own owl. You can make a screech owl nest box. I did bring some plans if you want to pick them up a little bit later if I have enough to go around. But this is a screech owl nest box. It's kind of like an overgrown bluebird house. Whereas a bluebird takes about an 1.5 inch entrance hole, a screech owl takes about a 3-inch entrance hole there, and a much larger box. But certain owls are cavity nesters. Certain owls actually nest and build branch-type nests, but some of them are cavity nesters. And screech owls are very effectively lured in to nest where you want them to in your yard, where you can kind of claim them as long as you don't make a pet out of them and say they're your owls, even though they're really not, out in the wild. And a screech owl box like that is very, very effective. In fact, I know a couple of people who have actually gone out, put up a screech owl box, the very next day had screech owls in it, or a couple other folks that actually were going out on a ladder, putting a screech owl box up, didn't finish the installation, came back the next day and screech owls had already moved in and it was sitting on top of the ladder. So screech owl boxes really do work. There's a lot of other animals too, like squirrels, flying squirrels, and daytime gray squirrels, and I've even had honeybees move into nest boxes like that. So you never know who's going to get there first, but they are very, very effective. In a lot of areas, you might have abundant prey for owls, but you might not have enough nesting sites, and cavity nesters like that would appreciate you doing something like that. So screech owls, very, very common bird we have in our area. Now, the next owl we're going to visit with is actually live and in person here, but we're going to show you a little picture of it to begin with here. And this next owl is one of my favorite of all the owls, simply because it's had some, well, one thing, it's pretty large, but it's not our largest owl, but it is also an owl that has a lot of interesting stories about it, makes some very interesting sounds, and it's pretty common depending on where you live. And it's called the barred owl. Okay, and I always give people a little spelling lesson when I give you that name, because barred sounds a lot like another owl with a similar sounding name, which we'll talk about in a moment. But barred is B-A-R-R-E-D. It's named for the pattern of the owl, little bars or little stripes. Some are vertical, some are horizontal. But it's kind of a gray and light gray colored owl. Great effective camouflage of the light and dark areas of its body, matching the light and dark of the shade of the woods and the forest there with the furrowed bark and the limbs. And it's one of our more common owls, one of the few owls that you might actually hear calling during the daylight hours, or maybe actually seen moving around a little bit during the daylight hours. And it seems to be particularly common wherever we have wetlands that are associated with woods, particularly old growth forests, because they also nest in cavities. But it would be a much bigger cavity than a nest box like a screech owl. But there are plans over there if you want to try to build a barred owl nest box. You'll need a little help to get up in the tree, though. So it's much, much larger, but they are somewhat effective. But barred owls are pretty common throughout much of the eastern United States, but particularly in areas that have swamps and wetlands associated with rivers and streams. And the wetter the better, because they can feed on a lot of different prey, including things like crayfish and salamanders and frogs, even though a lot of other owls, including them, the barred owl, will also eat a lot of rodents, rabbits, and warm-blooded prey as well. So they're a very common owl around our area. So we're going to take one out here and visit with it. And notice I'm putting on my protective gear here. And owls have some awesome weapons. And this bird we're going to look at, we'll talk about its story here in just a moment, but it's a pretty calm owl compared to this other here. You can hear it hissing a little bit. Doesn't seem very happy to be here. But barred owls have always been one of my favorites, and might be because one of the very first birds I ever had any kind of a contact with rehabilitating was a barred owl. And I've had a few interesting stories along the way about barred owls too. Maybe I'll share one or two with you. Now, when I take my barred owl out, I'm going to quickly go over here for a moment, because go ahead, do it and get it over with. This owl loves to take a poop as soon as I take it out of the carrier. But you're not going to do it now. You're going to wait till I get on a nice hardwood floor, and then I'll have to clean it up. Right? Okay. Or maybe we get lucky and won't do anything at all. But this is a barred owl. And you might wonder, well, does he have a name? Yeah, he has a name. His name is Harry. I'll tell you why that's He has the name Harry here in just a little bit because that kind of goes with his story. But barred owls, as I mentioned, are fairly common owls in a lot of areas. They're pretty large owl, not our largest owl. By the way, males and females are a little bit different in size in all the owl species, including all the birds of prey. The birds of prey that are males are usually a little smaller than the females, but that's a relative thing. You see large female owls or small female owls. You see large males, small males. So it's a little hard to tell externally by looking at most owls whether they're a boy or a girl. We're assuming he's a boy, but we don't know 100% for sure. We can find out with a DNA test, but that involves drawing a little blood, and I've talked about that. He said no. Or she said no. Didn't care to do that. But in any case, barred owls are pretty common birds, and they like that old growth forest because they are cavity nesters, but you can find them just about anywhere, even close to people sometimes. And once again, name for the barred pat. There we go. Just had to get that out of the way. Yeah. Well, I came prepared. I always bring my paper towels and stuff like that. So we got a volunteer. You don't have to clean it up, just maybe cover it. Usually I just leave it, but people have a tendency to stare at it the whole time, and they're not looking at the owl. Particularly when I'm doing a program with kids, it seems like the poop is more exciting than the owl. I don't know.
Kind of splattered a bit.
Yeah, it does splatter a little bit.
It's not the first time.
It's no big deal to me. This happens to me all the time. This might be for you. I don't know. But in any case, barred owl is very, very interesting. Now notice this owl does not have feathers, tufts that stick up like the screech owl or like his larger cousin, the great horned owl. They just have a rounded face, nothing sticking up there at all. But this is a great owl to look about and talk a little bit about general features of owls. Owls are very recognizable because they do have that rounded face. And the reason they have a rounded face and forward-facing eyes, first of all, they are a predatory bird, so they find their food. Most predators have their eyes fixed towards the front of the face. But the rounded face of an owl is an adaptation for actually not sight, but it's for hearing. And even though owls have a great sense of sight in dark areas, scientists claim that in pitch black, they don't see that well. But usually if you go out at night, even on a very dark night, if you let your eyes adjust, you can see a little bit. And you can see some starlight coming down, even water reflecting moonlight or starlight. There's very few nights where it's just so black you can't see anything. So an owl does have a very large eye where the pupil can cover a whole eye when it opens up. So that does make them better able to see in the dark than a lot of other creatures there. But also, they also find a lot of their food that they feed on in the dark by hearing, but not only by sight. And some owls actually have very relatively small eyes in comparison, but the ones that have bigger eyes like this owl probably find their food more by sight than anything, but hearing is very important. And they have huge ears. Can everybody see the big ears on this owl? Not even in the front row, can you? No, not even in the front, because an owl's ears are hidden. But if you look at the rounded face of this owl, and right behind its eye, right here on the edge of the fringe of the facial, is a big, large, crescent-shaped opening on the either side of the owl. Now, sometimes with a small group, I'll open the ear up and let you look in, but it'll probably be a little bit hard to show everybody in a group this size. But I'm going to put my finger in here very gently and go up and down right here. And I'm actually touching the outside of the ear here. So it's very large, crescent opening. One is a little higher than the other. It's a little asymmetrical. And that face acts like, well, if you remember the old days when we all had satellite dishes to get TV signals, the big giant satellite, now we have these little ones, But those pick up tiny little signals and funnel them down to the transmitter. Sounds in the forest are transmitted by a rounded face through the feathers down into those ear openings, and an owl like this can sense where something is coming from, a sound, even without seeing it. So they can focus on it, tilt their heads right and left, and then maybe fly in a little closer and find out where it is, and then maybe actually get a visual sighting. Or some owls that actually hunt and can find their food without ever actually seeing it, can pounce on it just by hearing alone. So that's why an owl's face is rounded. And when an owl captures its food, it grabs it with its beak and holds on to it, but these are weapons. That's why I'm wearing this big heavy glove. The talons or claws of an owl or a hawk or any other bird of prey, or we call them talons, are razor sharp, and an owl has very, very strong feet. So they grab their prey, they grab it with the beak, but they grab it with the feet first. They might break the spinal cord, and then they usually, if it's small enough, they swallow their food whole. Some larger owls may tear food up into small pieces, but most owls will swallow their food whole. And even though that doesn't look like their mouth is that big, once it opens up, it's a huge cavernous space there, and it's absolutely incredible the things that they can sometimes swallow in one piece. Yes?
This bird seems totally comfortable with you touching its face, its head.
Yeah.
Is that normal?
Well, of course not. But this owl's been in captivity a couple years, and see, now it's saying, okay, I got to get out of here now. But you know, this species of owl is a kind of a species that does better in captivity than some other species. So it's a little bit more likely that this is calm enough that I can do this kind of stuff. But also it has a little bit to do with the personality of the individual bird. But barred owls in general do pretty good in captivity as far as calming down and that sort of thing. So, but he lets me do that a little bit as long as I don't do too much of it. Yes.
So will an owl that size be able to prey on a full-grown chicken?
A full-grown chicken, it possibly could, but it probably would not be its number one prey. They almost always take things that are the most easily accessible to them, you know, so they're not going to hunt out something that's big just because it's good to eat, you know, when they bypass lots of other smaller prey. So they're going to take the most easily accessible thing depending on the season of the year. But this type of bird will sometimes prey on smaller owls, particularly things like screech owls. So whenever you have a big owl around, a little owl always has to be a little bit wary of being heard and seen.
His wing is damaged.
Yeah, we're going to talk about his wing here in just a moment. But, you know, sometimes when people see an owl like this, they say, well, it doesn't look that big, you know. But, you know, owls, when they spread their wings to fly, really do look huge. And this is a silhouette, a life-size silhouette of a barred owl right here, okay? So when they jump off their perch and fly and spread their wings, they're a whole lot bigger than you think. But they don't weigh as much as you think they do. Actually, a barred owl like this weighs mostly maybe 2 pounds, you know, sometimes a little bit less than that. Whereas something like the screech owl we just saw is literally just a few ounces in weight, much less than a pound. But even they have a very wide wingspan when they fly, so it makes them look a lot larger than sitting on a branch or something when you see them being very, very small. So owls can kind of change your size depending on whether they're flying, pulling in their feathers, fluffing themselves out, whatever, and look very different, yes.
Does his coloring change with the seasons?
No, his coloring is pretty much the same. Yeah, sometimes when owls get a little bit older, they may darken up, but barred owls pretty much look a little bit, pretty much like you see it right here.
Do owls eat other birds? My question is it, if you have a plethora of small birds in your yard regularly, is it a good idea to lure an owl?
Well, it'd be hard to kind of lure an owl in, but you know, if there's food there, an owl find it, he might find it on his own. But more likely, you're going to have other things like daytime sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, something like that, feeding on birds that come to a bird feeder. And owls like this, the birds that they would feed on mostly would be birds that are sitting on a perch at night, sitting in a tree, a bush, shrub, or something like that, where they just pick them off, and they're not going to catch them in flight or ambush them because the other birds are probably too quick to get away. So they just, you know, opportunistic, but sneak up on it. And, you know, songbirds usually don't see very well at night. They're sitting on the branches, and if these guys can see them, it makes it easy prey for them. Yes.
I'm just curious, why is this particular owl not being, why can't you release it?
Okay, well, okay, we'll talk about that then. Yes.
Does the asymmetrical ear placement have a purpose?
Does it have a purpose? Yes. Because the sounds are out there, you know, things can be high or low. If your ears are kind of asymmetrical, you can kind of pinpoint more on the sound here and pinpoint here and actually draw coordinates in your mind as exactly where that sound is coming from. It's a very accurate way instead of having just perfectly symmetrical ears, believe it or not. Yes?
A couple of things. Is it like echolocation like that is what they're wearing? And also, aren't their bones hollow? Birds' bones?
Birds' bones are not completely hollow, but they have a lot of hollow spaces in them. Yeah. Okay, so we had a question here about this owl and why it's unreleasable to the wild. This owl was hunting, as I mentioned, like screech owls often do, that this owl also is a type that might hunt along the side of a highway. And this owl was in South Carolina a couple years back and was evidently hunting along the side of the highway. Must have swooped down to grab some prey, flew in the path of a car and had a collision with a car. Somebody else came along and found this owl sitting in the road, unable to fly. Scooped it up, put it in a cardboard box, came home, made some phone calls, found me, and to make another long story short, this bird's wingtip was almost completely torn off from the tips of the what would be analogous to our fingers, and the veterinarian was able to stitch it back on, literally bandaged for about a month or so. It healed and actually took and stayed on there, but it doesn't have any flexibility. So this bird has been deemed unreleasable to the wild simply because it can't fly as well as it should be able to hunt and capture its prey. And even birds that have total flight ability, nothing wrong with them, often starve to death in the wild simply because it's hard to live as a predator in the wild. So birds like this that are kept in captivity always have something wrong with them. They're unreleasable because of an injury or something else that makes them unreleasable. Then they go through a permitting process with the Fish and Wildlife Service to be permitted to be used as education animals in captivity, but not as pets.
So other than getting hit by a car, do owls have predators that feed on them?
Oh yeah, larger owls. And also an owl like this, as it gets older, you never see an old predator in the wild. Predators, as they get older, they slow down, they can't capture the food as much, they get a little weaker, then they may just die or something else suddenly can take advantage of that and prey on them. So a raccoon, bobcat, any number of things could kill an owl like this if he's not in prime condition. And obviously a bigger owl as well.
Would you like more window light?
If y'all, it would probably be helpful as long as it's not lighting somebody's eyes.
Behind you.
Yeah.
Drown it.
Yeah.
Carl,
Is that okay with everybody?
what did you feed an owl in the wild, in
Okay.
captivity?
Yeah, an owl like this in captivity, sometimes we feed them mice, but also there are captive diets made for owls and other birds of prey in captivity, which this owl eats some of that, but I'm trying to mix it up with a variety of different things, but they're not fed live prey in captivity. They don't need to hunt in captivity. It's impractical to keep living things like that in captivity for them to feed on. Okay. So, one of the interesting things about barred owls, I think, are their calls. And I'm going to play a few calls of a barred owl, but a lot of people can identify the call of a barred owl simply because it almost sounds like somebody saying human words, a phrase, who cooks for you, who cooks for you all. So if you can remember that, there's no other owl that quite has that rhythm to it. Who cooks for you, who cooks for you all, but who cooks for you, who cooks for you all. But they often change that up a little bit and just do the last few syllables, or they make monkey-like howls. And I've actually had people call me on the phone, want to know if monkeys live here in North Carolina. And no, they don't, but barred owls do. But they make a plethora of different calls that don't even sound like owl calls, don't sound like animal calls, don't even sound like humans. I always say if you're ever out in the wild and you hear a strange sound, blame it on a barred owl because it's probably one of the sounds that they make.
They hunt more in the daylight or the dark?
In the dark, but they have been known to hunt during the daylight hours as well. Now we got one more screech owl call to get out of there, I think. Okay. And that's a screech owl finishing up, so we should have a barred owl call coming up there. One more screech owl call. I think there's food over there, don't you? Okay. Now you're really confused, aren't you? And that is also a call a screech owl can make, kind of a screeching sound, which you think you would hear from a screech owl, but barred owl. Yeah. And also there's a sound that barred owls make. I always like to tell the story about one of the most frightening sounds a barred owl makes. And back in the 1970s, it was a most memorable time for me when I was much younger, and I spent a lot of time deer hunting in the mountains of West North Carolina. And I had a great place picked out on a lonely mountaintop ridge. It took a long time to get there. And but I was there early one morning, 2 hours before the sun came up, getting ready to hunt, walking through the forest, being quiet as I could. Came through a thicket of mountain laurel that's evergreen during the month of November when the deer season began. Sneaking around, making very little sound. And I walked out of this mountain laurel thicket and stopped underneath an oak tree. And unknown to me, there's a barred owl sitting on a low branch above my head. Instead of just sitting there and watching me and let me go by, or flying off, which I wouldn't have been able to see him in the darkness, he did what owls sometimes do in moments of distress. He let out a high-pitched scream at the top of his lungs. And if you've ever heard the sound of a barred owl screaming, you know it's very frightening, very blood-curdling. And imagine that happening to you right above your head in the darkness with no warning whatsoever. One of the most frightening moments I've ever had in my entire life. I found myself face down on the ground, heart pounding into the frosty leaves, head in the crook of my arm, but I had a good story to tell, but I actually scared the barred owl a lot worse. So many people have been frightened by the sounds these owls make. They can make some very unusual sounds, but normally you don't get too close to them like I did in that situation to have them scream at you unless you're a predator trying to grab them or something. But they're capable of a lot of very unusual sounds. By the way, before I put him up, you might notice, now he's getting a little nervous.